Good day. A few weeks ago, I was discussing in programs on this channel the train wreck of a visit by the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Josep Borrell, to Moscow. Over the course of that visit, Josep Borrell sought to lecture the Russians on human rights and on their domestic policy, and first and foremost on their treatment of the Russian dissident politician and blogger Alexei Navalny. To his shock and dismay, he found the Russians in no mood to accept any lectures and found them pushing back aggressively against him. The Russians brought up the subject of Catalonia, and they even showed him a film of Western riot police breaking up protests in various Western cities. Borrell went away from Moscow, deeply shaken, proposed that the EU impose sanctions against Russia, but found that there was little enthusiasm in European capitals for such a step, and the EU seems to have been shaken and chastened by those events ever since. Something very similar, though perhaps on an even more grandiose scale, took place in Anchorage, Alaska, over the last couple of days. The United States, or to be more precise, the new Biden administration, invited senior officials of the Chinese government to attend a meeting with a US delegation led by Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Alaska. It's not entirely clear why the US chose Anchorage, Alaska, as the place to hold this summit. I would say that the Chinese, knowing little about Alaska, might not have been entirely pleased with that, seeing a US decision to hold a summit of this importance in a place like Anchorage as an attempt by the US to belittle the US-China relationship by relegating meetings between Chinese and US officials to provincial capitals, as the Chinese would see Anchorage, as opposed to the centers of US power, such as Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and New York. Anyway, putting all that aside, the US, prior to this meeting, engaged in a drumroll of criticism of China and made it fairly clear that it was going to take a very strong line with China at this meeting. Firstly, there were articles which appeared in Western news agencies such as Reuters and Associated Press, saying that this meeting between the United States and China in Anchorage would be a one-off, that there would not be future meetings in that kind of format, and that from that point onward, the US and China would be conducting one-to-one meetings rather than these sort of plenary meetings at which the entire US-China relationship would be discussed. Then there were comments that appeared by senior US officials. President Biden himself spoke of China and the US being in a condition of intense competition. Secretary Blinken, in a long speech he made at the start of this month, identified China as the US's primary superpower challenger. Perhaps most extraordinary and worrying of all was an extraordinary report published on the website of the Atlantic Council called The Longer Telegram. I've already discussed parts of this report in a video I have just done about US-Russian relations, in which I have pointed out how the author of this report, who calls himself anonymous, in other words, who does not identify himself, talks about the importance for the US of detaching Russia from China, and speaks of how the actions of previous US administrations in driving Russia towards China was the greatest geostrategic error made by the US in recent decades. The actual focus of this so-called longer telegram is not, however, Russia. It is, in fact, China. In fact, it discusses at quite astonishing length the challenge and even the threat that China supposedly poses to the US. It does so in language which I personally find disturbing and unbalanced. It also demonizes President Xi Jinping of China in ways that I find both unhelpful and extraordinary. What makes this, frankly, troubling document particularly disturbing is that it seems to have been written by a senior official within the US government, almost certainly a member of the Biden administration. And frankly, reading some of the language, it appears to me to come from someone in Tony Blinken's circle, and quite conceivably may have been written, at least in part, by Tony Blinken himself. Now, the Chinese, of course, read everything that the United States government and its senior officials and top US publications say about them. And, of course, they also take note of what senior US officials like President Biden and Secretary Blinken say about them also. They will not have been unaware of the hard line and hostility that the US was manifesting towards China in advance of the summit in Anchorage. But perhaps most extraordinary of all, the Chinese will undoubtedly have noted that sections of the US media were openly discussing how the US delegation at the Anchorage summit was intending to put China publicly on the spot on human rights issues. This is all going to happen in the opening statements with the world's television cameras there. Now, if you're going to set an ambush, it is never a good idea to alert the person you're going to ambush of the fact in advance. The Chinese, reading all these reports, listening to all these statements, digesting all these comments, of course, prepared themselves fully for this attack that they were anticipating from the US at the summit in Anchorage, and they came fully prepared. A government in the US that was properly informed about China and had a more clear understanding of the nature of the challenge China poses would have been prepared for the fact. In any event, what happened was a train wreck, as it became completely clear that the United States, or at least the Blinken delegation, came to the Anchorage summit far less prepared than the Chinese were. There were certain comments, certain very harsh comments from the US about Chinese behavior on human rights. The topics of Hong Kong and Xinjiang province and the Uyghurs were brought up, but the US seems to have been totally thrown off balance and long nonplussed by a long 15-minute lecture on human rights issues delivered by the head of the Chinese delegation, a Politburo member, Yang Jiechi. The Chinese, feeling that they got the better of these exchanges, have been gloating ever since. And I use the word gloating carefully because through the measured words, that is how the Chinese media has been reporting the fact. I would add that from what I have heard, Chinese netizens, the various people who comment and discuss and talk about things on Chinese language websites, have been massively energized by the vigorous defense, as they see it, of Chinese positions by the Chinese delegation at Anchorage, and the reputation of the Chinese delegation has been greatly enhanced in their eyes. Now, I'm going to read some extracts about all of this from the Chinese media, just to give you some measure of the pleasure the Chinese are taking in what happened. Now, I'm focusing on Global Times because it is the semi-official newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party, and of course it is written in English, but similar things have been said in China by the Chinese language media there. Anyway, the first editorial, and it's an editorial, so it is actually written by someone very close to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government. The first editorial reads as follows: Alaska talks to be remembered in history as a landmark. That is the title. And the body of the editorial reads in part as follows: The China-US talks in Alaska are very likely to be given great importance in history. The talks are being held at an important time when China-US relations are at the crossroads, carrying a lot of weight. Note how the editorial writer for Global Times speaks of China-US relations, not US-China relations. The editorial writer is careful to put China first. The editorial then goes on as follows: The warm-up of the talks in Alaska has long begun. The US has released a series of tough words and deeds to put pressure on China. Such a gesture by Washington has lasted until the opening remarks of the talks. The US, in its public speech, which went seriously over time, carried out groundless attacks against China, especially mentioning many of Chinese internal affairs, including Xinjiang and Hong Kong, trying to gain the upper hand. Yang Jiechi, a member of the Political Bureau of the Communist Party of China's Central Committee and director of the Office of the Central Leading Group for Foreign Affairs, and Chinese State Chancellor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, dealt with this calmly. Yang said that in front of the Chinese side, the US is not qualified to speak to China from a position of strength. And Wang said that the old habit of US hegemonic behavior of willfully interfering in China's internal affairs must be changed. Then the editorial writer goes on to say, this is an unprecedented, open, face-to-face confrontation between China and the US in recent decades. It has great impact and also a correction of the US's understanding and long-held attitude towards China. It tells Washington that the US should stop pretending that they can point a finger at China. That era is over. The US must deal with China in an equal and respectful way to resolve problems with China. With China's rapid development, the power gap between China and the US has been narrowing, and the US feels a strategic crisis. Washington has always twisted the facts. It has been bragging about its allies as it undermines the rules. It also blatantly is promoting a so-called rules-based international order. Everything Washington talks about is centered on the US and on white supremacy. The interests of the US and its few allies have become the starting point of right and wrong. The Chinese delegation has made a historic move to set things right. Their statements have formed a strong refutation of that of the US, which has impacted on the US's stereotype and will make the international community think. The world's sense of right and wrong is not in Washington's hands. So, talks in Alaska are therefore likely to be regarded as a milestone in this process by history. In other words, what the Chinese are saying is that for the first time in recent history, someone has told the United States to shut up. That is quite an astonishing perspective that the Chinese have on the talks, and they followed it up with more comments. Now, there has been a subsequent editorial by Global Times, which reads as follows. After a fierce tit-for-tat opening, the closed-door strategic dialogue between China and the US in Alaska went smoothly, and the result was far better than people's expectations. The Alaska meeting was initiated by the US. It made great efforts in it, in fear that the Chinese side would underestimate the US's tough stand. The US views its alliance system as a prominent bargaining chip to pressure China. It has shown no intention to eradicate the Trump administration's extreme China policy. The Chinese side has understood Washington's determination to use every possible way to maintain its hegemony and realized the Biden administration's continuity of the Trump administration regarding its China policy. It is believed the US will understand China more. Obviously, there are deep differences between both sides. The US should get to know China's political confidence and its resolve and ability to develop and thrive steadily in accordance with its long-term plans. It also knows that China despises the pressure imposed by the US and its allies. China doesn't care about its geopolitical tools. The US must have had a sense of futility about containing China. In recent years, China's self-confidence is more powerful than the US's. The US has made up false justice in wooing its allies and containing China with the so-called human rights. In terms of the essence of the China-US conflict, it is the US's malicious strategic objectives of maintaining its hegemony and suppressing the fast development of China as the world's most populous country. On the contrary, China is maintaining its right to develop and the right of the Chinese people to live a better life. As China-US struggles on, the Chinese people's unity and the global moral call will expose the US's weakness. It is a fantasy to strike China down. Putting China in awe is daydreaming. Now, of course, this is all the Chinese view of the talks. However, most objective observers who followed the talks in Alaska, and in particular who watched the video that the United States was foolish enough to allow to be made of the opening statements, I think agree that it was undoubtedly the Chinese who got the better of these exchanges. I would add that I've also seen some commentary to that effect in parts of the American media. The Federalist, admittedly no friend of the Biden administration, also says that the Blinken team were comprehensively outmatched by the Chinese. What baffles me about all of this is why the United States, or to be precise, why Tony Blinken and his team put themselves in this position. Why, in effect, they gave China this golden opportunity to set up, to achieve such a spectacular propaganda win. I say that because I repeat again, the Chinese were informed by the US in advance from open commentary that the US was intending to criticize China on human rights and values issues. And the US, again, arranged for the opening words of the talks, the opening exchanges, to be made public and publicly filmed. It should not have been difficult to anticipate that the Chinese would carefully prepare in advance for that, which is precisely what happened. And it is bizarre that setting the scene for this, the United States, or at least the Blinken team, doesn't seem to have been prepared for the strength of the Chinese response. No wonder the Chinese are gloating, which of course they are. It is the whole Josep Borrell affair all over again, this time with the US instead of the European Union caught in the hot seat, and it all being done publicly in front of the television cameras. This is emphatically not the way to conduct diplomacy. And my one hope is that in future, the Biden-Blinken team will learn from this and will realize that if they want to exchange strong words with China, the far better advised to do that in private rather than to do it in this public way in front of the television cameras, and at the very least be fully prepared in advance for what the Chinese might say. The Chinese, having scored what they see as a propaganda win, and one which, as these editorials in Global Times show, they believe will resound around the world, are now looking forward. And they have invited Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Beijing. And we now have, about that, another editorial appearing in Global Times. And its title is China-Russia Ties Deepen whilst US and allies flail. And it contains comments like this. The US has been arrogant and overbearing lately, publicly and simultaneously piling pressure on both China and Russia. On March 17th, US President Biden said, "I do," when asked if he believed the Russian president was a killer in a television interview. The US also repeatedly claimed recently that China poses the 21st century's greatest geopolitical challenge. Washington's offensive policies have further exacerbated the global geopolitical shock. Washington is playing a game that is surely to harm itself and likely does no good to its Asian allies. Its hegemonic framework remains roughly the same, yet its internal supportive power is weakening. The problem will not be resolved by strengthening ties with its allies. The tactic may give the US more courage, but it is essentially exposing US diffidence. And then it goes on to say uh, a number of really rather remarkable things about the power, the aggregate power of China and Russia, and of the Chinese-Russian strategic partnership. And I will read them, and I think they need to be noted very carefully. The editorial says the following: the most influential bilateral relationship in Eurasia is the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a New Era. China and Russia understand the weight of their ties. When the two sides continue to deepen their relations, they also take care of the feelings of other countries. To be honest, no country in the region can stand alone against either China or Russia, let alone fight against the two powers at the same time. It would be disastrous for any country which tends to confront China and Russia through forging an alliance with the US. When Washington shows hostility to Beijing and Moscow simultaneously, Japan has sent a very negative message to both China and Russia by binding itself tightly with the US. US senior officials have recently paid visits to Japan, South Korea, and India. Whatever South Korea and India talk behind closed doors with the US, they did not mention China in their joint statements. So, in effect, what the Chinese are saying is that the United States is weakening internally, that any country that relies on the US is going to be disappointed because US power is reducing, and the China-Russia Grand Strategic Partnership, or as the editorial calls it, the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a New Era, read alliance, is overwhelming in its power and can ride completely over any other country on the Eurasian continent, or indeed any combination of countries. It's an extraordinary comment, and it shows both the extent of Chinese self-confidence and of the importance of the Russian alliance to China. It also, incidentally, shows that the part of the longer telegram, that bizarre document, that bizarre report which I discussed, which talks about the importance of Russia to China, is absolutely correct. The US faces unquestionably a major strategic challenge coming from China. I don't think that a policy of this kind of strange confrontation, in which you are insulting to the Chinese to their face, as the US was in Alaska, actually gets the US anywhere. I think the US does need to take steps to restore or at least rebalance its relationship with China. But as these editorials in Global Times show, the priority has to be sorting out the accumulating and very grave problems within the United States itself. That, by the way, was very much Donald Trump's philosophy. It doesn't seem to be shared to anything like the same degree by the Biden administration, which seems instead to be implementing a whole diverse range of domestic policies which look to me rather like a shopping list of progressive demands which have been made of the administration by the various disparate elements that make up the Democratic Party's coalition. In addition, the US simply cannot afford this constant criticism and harassment of Russia in which it is engaging. It is not changing Russian policy. It is making the Russians increasingly angry and mistrustful of the US, and is making this strategic alliance that has now emerged between China and Russia ever stronger, giving the Chinese that enormous confidence which these Global Times editorials show. The US needs a fundamental rethinking of its foreign policy. It needs to stop its policies towards Russia and try to find an accommodation with it, and it needs to talk in a practical way with China, making clear what its red lines are, but also understanding that China's rise is now past the point that the United States can realistically hope to reverse it. Above all, the United States needs a geopolitical ceasefire with both China and Russia at this time so that it can address and sort out its urgent domestic problems. The comments the Chinese made at the summit in Anchorage and in these articles, these editorials in Global Times, touching upon the fierce issues that caused so much protest and so much anger over the course of the summer of 2020, with all those fiery protests and passionate actions in US cities over the course of that summer. These are things that the Chinese are aware of. They perceive them as signs of weakness, and they see them as giving China propaganda talking points, which the Chinese showed they're able to use both in the summit in Anchorage to the US delegation's face and in their commentaries in their own domestic media. In my opinion, the US still has the time and the space and the resources to turn things round. If it fails to do so, then I think that it could find itself up against, in the form of the Chinese-Russian alliance, and specifically and primarily the Chinese part of it, an unstoppable force. We shall see whether that happens. I have to say, with a dysfunctional administration there is at the moment in Washington, the omens are not good. Thank you for joining me on this program. Please look me up in my future programs on this channel and in other programs which I do on our main channel, the Duran, with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel and our new channel where we publish the interactions we have with our viewers in our live streams. Please also check us out on our various platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and above all, Odyssey, which we have found to be a superb platform. Please also support us as you can through PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Let me just remind you that we accept donations in Bitcoin and in other such currencies. If you can make such donations, please also support us by coming to our shop. Finding the amazing things we have there, our famous magic mugs, our t-shirts, long sleeved and short sleeved, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and the rest. Please also check out our Discord server. And last but not least, remember to subscribe to this channel and to all our other channels also. And thank you for joining me on this program. And I look forward to you joining me in future programs. And have a wonderful day until then.